Marley was dead to begin with. There is no doubt whatever about that. The register of his burial was signed by the clergyman, the clerk, the undertaker, and the chief mourner. Scrooge signed it, and Scrooge's name was good upon change for anything he chose to put his hand to. Old Marley was as dead as a doornail. Hello, my wonderful viewers, and welcome to Betty Adams Overanalyzes Christmas Special. You may recognize those words. They're quite famous. It is the opening of The Christmas Carol. That famous story that has been made into plays and movies and remade hundreds of times since it was first published in 1843. And today I just wanted to take time to go through 5 of my favorite Christmas stories. Some of the books, like A Christmas Carol, are entirely about Christmas. Some of them just have a Christmas chapter and go through an entire year or two of the life of the characters. But I just wanted to walk through the themes. Many people call Charles Dickens the man who invented Christmas. He sort of revivified the season in Britain to some extent. And everything that runs through his story, you find it again and again. He definitely set the tone for Christmas literature. We all know the story of A Christmas Carol. So I guess I'll warn you about spoilers. If you don't want any spoilers for A Christmas Carol, Annals of a Quiet Neighborhood, Little Women, The Gift of the Magi, or The Best Worst Christmas Pageant Ever, you can click away now, check out the links below the video to get yourself a copy of one of my books. I will also be including below the video the links to all 5 of these stories, where you can go online and read them for free if you like. Most of them have some version of them up on YouTube as an audiobook or as a full-on movie. So, A Christmas Carol, written by Charles Dickens in 1843. This was as much him trying to bring awareness to an issue of the day, the poverty of the lower classes in Great Britain at the time, as it was him trying to tell and sell a Christmas story. And that kind of shows here when we get to the scene where Scrooge has already experienced the ghost of Christmas past. He's working with the ghost of Christmas present, and they've just finished examining Bob Cratchit's house. They're talking, and Scrooge asks the spirit whether Tiny Tim will live. "I see a vacant seat," replied the ghost, "in the poor chimney corner, and a crutch without an owner, carefully preserved. If these shadows remain unaltered by the future, the child will die." "No, no," said Scrooge. "Oh, no, kind spirit, say he will be spared." "If these shadows remain unaltered by the future, none other of my race," returned the ghost, "will find him here. What then? If he be like to die, he had better do it, and decrease the surplus population." Scrooge hung his head to hear his own words quoted by the spirit, and was overcome with penitence and grief. "Man," said the ghost, "if man you be in heart, not adamant, forbear that wicked cant until you have discovered what the surplus is, and where it is. Will you decide what men shall live, what men shall die? It may be that in the sight of heaven you are more worthless and less fit to live than millions like this poor man's child. Oh God, to hear the insect on the leaf pronouncing on the too much life among his hungry brothers in the dust." This quote goes to the way that people spoke about the population of the earth, about their fellow humans in that day and to this day. People talked about the population bomb in the 60s and 70s of the last century, the same as they were 100 years before that in this time. Too many people, not enough resources, and yet we're still here. One of the things that my biology and ecology professors would talk about with rueful embarrassment was how much they believed in the population bomb, or in ecology we called it living on lag time before the population collapsed. But decade after decade passed from their college days, and there was no population collapse, not from starvation as was predicted in the 1840s, predicted in the 1960s, and yet another century rolled by, another millennium rolled by, and the problems were solved by human ingenuity, by the presence of humans, not their absence. And to hear the old professors talk about, I guess, how much they would have vibed with the concept of surplus population and believing in it, it was pretty humbling, that recognition of the things you believe so strongly in your college days. As a scientist, sometimes you just gotta let them go. Anyway, getting back to the Christmas theme here, you have this running theme through A Christmas Carol where you have these upper class people being shown in the body of Scrooge how much joy and reality there is in the lower classes, being shown that we're all humans together, all experiencing the joys, whether we be in a nice house in London or a sailor on a ship in sea, experiencing the joys and trials of the season. From a writing perspective, one thing as so many of the points in A Christmas Carol are still so solid today. This mentioning of how these well-educated people often consider, if you're not well-educated, if you're not rich, if you don't belong to that upper class, you're just extra unnecessary. And how that can corrupt their perception of charity and kindness and their duties to the humans around them. Some of those are so as true today as they were over 200 years ago when this story was written. And when you read the book or when you watch the movie, it comes out clearly. When you see Bob Cratchit shivering in his office because the temperature is too cold for him and his boss isn't paying him what he deserves, we understand that today. And so this is what makes this a timeless classic. However, oftentimes what is left out of these stories are the bits that are less timeless. There's another section where it's the Ghost of Christmas Present. Again, with the Ghost of Christmas Present, Scrooge is talking to him about a very timely modern concept. You see, back in those days, back in the 1840s, it was not common for individual apartments to have cooking features. You couldn't have an electric hot plate. There was no electricity. There was no stove. And so these people had to take their food to bakeries and pay to have the bakery bake it. But there was a movement at the time to give those poor hardworking bakers the vacation they needed on Sundays and Christmas and other holidays. So basically to close down the bakeries on these holidays, which would have denied a major portion of the population access to more hot food. They'd have to eat cold food or just go without until the next day. And because this was being done in the name of charity, of Christmas charity, to give the bakers the day off, Scrooge kind of taxes the Ghost of Christmas Present with it. And the ghost is like, nah, don't put that on me. That's a human thing. And it's very interesting. It is a very complex concept. The only similar thing we have today would be the making sure to close down the stores on Thanksgiving and Christmas so the retail workers can get their rest. But it's different. Back in the day, the necessity of keeping the bakeries open was a major source of health and comfort to these poor people. It's just not today because of microwaves and refrigerators and stoves and basically universal electricity. And that bit is generally left out of adaptations, be it the famous Muppets Christmas Carol or the older ones from the 50s, because in a modern day and age, it's it would take a lot of explaining and would slow down the pace of the movie, and so it generally doesn't get included. So this is a lack of timelessness that as an author kind of stands out to me. And there is so much more I could go on saying about the Christmas Carol, but I don't want this to be an hour-long video, so let's just move on. Annals of a Quiet Neighborhood. Written about 20 years after Christmas Carol, 19 years after. And it just, the book as a whole tells the story of a parson who comes to a seaside, a quiet parish in Britain, far from London. And as we get into chapter 10, we get introduced to the Christmas party chapter. And this chapter, this introduction of Christmas is very different. We have Scrooge, an outsider to the church and to the parson of his community, versus this is the parson, and he is representing the church and what the church does for the community, both poor and rich, on Christmas. And this parson decides that he's going to make it, not a huge deal, but he's going to have a whole church party, invite the whole parish to his to the parsonage for a Christmas party. So he introduces it. I therefore had a notice to that purport affixed to the church door, and resolved to send out no personal invitations whatever, so that I might not give offence by accidental omission. The only person thrown into perplexity by this mode of proceeding was Mrs. Pearson, my housekeeper. How many am I to provide for, sir? She said with an injured air. For as many as you ever saw in church at one time, I said. And if there should be too much, why so much the better. It can go to make Christmas Day the merrier at some of the poorer houses. She looked discomposed, for she was not of an easy temper. But she never acted from her temper. She only looked or spoke from it. I shall want help, she said at length. As much as you like, Mrs. Pearson. I can trust you entirely. Her face brightened, and the end showed that I had not trusted her amiss. So here we have many of the same themes. You have these people, the parson and the people of his household, having to work harder on Christmas to provide for the poor. The remembrance that this is a time for remembering the poor, and also the remembrance that these aren't divine creatures. You are dealing with real human beings here. Mrs. Pearson, she's got a temper on her, and she might say snappy things, but she still tries to do the right thing. And this parson, the story goes on to tell how he was a little anxious about the outcome of his party, and how he tries to make this a spiritually uplifting time, but he understands human nature. There's games and dancing, and he makes it clear that people should come here to have fun, to celebrate Christmas. There's singing. And he even pauses to note that he knows that what he's seeing here is their good behavior, because people do have two sets of behavior. And he freely admits that when they come to the parsonage, to him for this entertainment he's giving, they're being on their best behavior. But he thinks, so be it. He knows he's seen them at their best, he's seen them at their worst as the parson, and he's happy to give them this entertainment. And it's just a delightful little description of a Christmas party, of people dancing and singing and peacemaking between the generations. The Annals of a Quiet Neighborhood, definitely worth the read, not just for the Christmas chapter. All of them have that kind of same wholesome, cozy feel to it. The third book I want to address, again, this book deals with multiple years of somebody's life, but Little Women by Louisa May Alcott. We move forward in time, 1 year this time, just to 1968. And this is Louise May Alcott wrote Little Women. It is not an autobiography, but it is heavily based on her life in New England. We've left London behind. We've left the island of Great Britain behind. We are now thousands of miles away across the Atlantic Ocean in New England. We have a culture that was definitely still inspired by Charles Dickens. And there, in this story, we have the Christmas chapter 2. We've kind of started out there. This is a very classic family type Christmas story where you have a family that's feeling the pinch of this year. It's the middle of the Civil War for them, the American Civil War. Resources are tight, and they have a limited budget to buy Christmas presents on. And that story goes through, and then, of course, being a Christmas story, it cycles back to remember it's not just you. Remember it's not just your family. So their mother was called out of the breakfast room early in the morning, and they're waiting for her to come back before they start eating breakfast. And she does, and they greet her, and they're so happy, and they're thankful for their gifts, as small as they were, and they're excited to give her gifts. But she greets them and says, "Merry Christmas, little daughters." Note, Merry Christmas, a distinctly something that came from Charles Dickens. "I'm glad you began at once, and hope you will keep on. But I want to say one word before we sit down. Not far away from here lies a poor woman with a little newborn baby. 6 children are huddled into one bed to keep from freezing, for they have no fire. There's nothing to eat over there, and the oldest boy came to tell me they were suffering hunger and cold. My girls, will you give them your breakfast as a Christmas present?" They were all unusually hungry, having waited nearly an hour, and for a minute no one spoke. Only a minute, for Joe exclaimed impetuously, "I'm so glad you came before we began." "May I go and help carry the things to the poor little children?" asked Beth eagerly. "I shall take cream in the muffins," added Amy, heroically giving up the article she most liked. Meg was already covering the buckwheats and piling bread onto one big plate. "I thought you'd do it," said Mrs. March, smiling as if satisfied. "You shall all go and help me, and when we come back we will have bread and milk for breakfast, and make up for it at dinner time." They were soon ready, and the procession set out. Fortunately, it was early, and they went through back streets, so few people saw them, and no one laughed at the queer party. A poor, bare, miserable room it was, with broken windows, no fire, ragged bedclothes, a sick mother, wailing baby, and a group of pale, hungry children cuddled under one old quilt, trying to keep warm. How the big eyes stared and the blue lips smiled as the girls went in. "Ach, mein Gott, it is good angels come to us," said the poor woman, crying for joy. "Funny angels in hoods and mittens," said Joe, and set them to laughing. Now, this is a long story that deals with many serious issues through the perspective of a family of almost entirely of women, because the father has gone to war. And it's quite different from A Christmas Carol, quite different from Annals of a Quiet Neighborhood. But again, the Christmas chapter circles back to this. Remember, it's not just you, it's not just your inner circle. Reach out to those around you, to the forgotten, to the hungry, to the poor. The next story is a bit different, primarily because it's a short story, very different in scope. It really only has 2 characters. A young woman and her young husband. And this is called The Gift of the Magi. And you may have heard it. The story focuses mainly on the wife as she's counting up her money. She's been saving up all year to get her husband a Christmas present, but she only has $1.87. Now, this story was written in 1905, so the inflation isn't going to be unimaginable, but it was more than it'd be worth now, but still not enough to get the gift she wanted to get him. And so she decides to make a sacrifice. She has this long, beautiful hair that is unusually long and unusually beautiful. So she goes downtown. Where she stopped, the sign read, Madame Saffron, hair goods of all kinds. One flight up Della ran and collected herself, panting. Madame, large, too white, chilly, hardly looked the soffroni. "Will you buy my hair?" asked Della. "I buy hair," said Madame. "Take your hat off and let's have a sight at the looks of it." Down rippled the brown cascade. $20, said Madame, lifting the mass with a practiced hand. "Give it to me quick," said Della. Oh, and the next 2 hours tripped by on rosy wings. Forget the hashed metaphor. She was ransacking the stores for Jim's present. She found it at last. It surely had been made for Jim and no one else. There was no other like it in any of the stores, and she had turned all of them inside out. It was a platinum fob chain, simple and chaste in design, properly proclaiming its value by substance alone, and not by meretricious ornamentation. As all good things should do, it was even worthy of the watch. As soon as she saw it, she knew that it must be Jim's. It was like him, quietness and value. The description applied to both. $21 they took from her for it, and she hurried home with the 87 cents. With that chain on his watch, Jim might be properly anxious about the time in any company. Grand as the watch was, he sometimes looked at it on the sly on account of the old leather strap he used in place of a chain. When Della reached home, her intoxication gave way a little to prudence and reason. She got out her curling irons and lighted the gas, and went to work repairing the ravages made by generosity added to love, which is always a tremendous task, dear friends, a mammoth task. So here we're looking at 1905. We've skipped forward another 30 or 40 years in time, and now more houses have somewhere to cook. More apartments are left without the need to go out and get their food elsewhere. And you have a more internalized story. This might be a young Bob and Mrs. Cratchit, early in their wedded life. But the technology has advanced, the culture has changed, and this is a story more focused on what happens within a family on Christmas. And if you know the story, well, Jim gets home and they exchange gifts. Not a very gripping story, USA, but again, go forth and read it. It's on Project Gutenberg, free for anybody to read. All four of the stories so far have been public domain, and you can go and get the full text on Project Gutenberg in the United States. Oh, and again, almost all of these are going to be available as audiobooks in one form or another, usually for free on YouTube. Moving on, we're going to be moving forward another few decades to the final one. This one is not yet in the public domain. It was published in 1972, so in living memory of many of us. The Best Worst Christmas Pageant Ever by Barbara Robinson. And in this story, you get the tale of the story is focused on a nice middle-class family, much like A Christmas Carol, much like Annals of a Quiet Neighborhood. Our main characters are people with respectable parents, respectable jobs, looking out at the world around them, and being told to remember that the other people around you are human too. The Best Worst Christmas Pageant Ever has a lot more in common with A Christmas Carol than the others, because what we have here is suburbanites. Classic 1970s U.S. suburbanites who are basically asked to socially interact with, well, the trailer people, to put it nicely. The Herdmans, a large family of children, too many children, not enough clothes, not enough food. The dad's disappeared. The mom works 3 shifts and really doesn't want to have much to do with her children. And this is these children, through one adventure or another, get invited to start attending Sunday school with this classy middle-class family. To all of the classy middle-class children's horror at first, because the Herdmans are wild. They say naughty words. They interrupt the teacher during Sunday school, and then comes time for the Christmas play. And the Herdmans decide that they want in on this. And so they bully the usual Mary and Joseph from backing out. Granted, the Joseph didn't have much objection to this because he'd been trying to shuck the role for several years, thinking himself too old for it. And they take over the Christmas play. So here's a little excerpt from that. "I've got the baby here," Imogen barked at the wise men. "Don't touch him. I named him Jesus." "No, no, no," Mother came flying up the aisle. "Now, Imogen, you know you're not supposed to say anything. Nobody says anything in our pageant, except the angel of the Lord and the choir singing carols. Mary and Joseph and the wise men make a lovely picture for us to look at while we think about Christmas and what it means." "I think I ought to tell them what his name is," Imogen said. "No, besides, remember, it wasn't Mary who named the baby." "I told you," Ralph whacked Imogen on the back. "I named him." "Joseph didn't name him either," Mother said. "God sent an angel to tell Mary what his name would be." Imogen sniffed. "I would have named him Bill." And, of course, all of these classy suburbanite children are horrified by this. The Herdmans gets reported for smoking in the bathroom by the local Karen's daughter. And the story goes on. And just like A Christmas Carol, this story is about reminding the classy, the stately middle-class people that we are all human. You are at heart no different than whoever you think might be below you on whatever social scale you used, be it Victorian England's very rigidly defined social status, or the more blurry but still very strict social status of suburbanite U.S. at the latter end of the 20th century. Take a moment and realize, just because there's a family that has more children than you think is proper, they're human. And thinking of them in terms of surplus population or just statistics involving in the population bomb, whichever century that idea is from, it's a bad idea. These are people. Remember that Christmas is specifically the time our culture stops, remembers that, and reaches out to everybody around us. So, what do you think? What is your favorite Christmas story? I chose these 5 because they left an impression in my mind when I read them, be it 10, 20, 30 years ago, the first time I read them. Goodness, I think I read A Christmas Carol closer to 40 than 30 years ago for the first time. But A Christmas Carol, Annals of a Quiet Neighborhood, Little Women, The Gift of the Magi, and The Best Worst Christmas Pageant Ever. That thread running through them. We're all human. We all have our good behavior and our bad behavior, and it's our bad behavior that makes us want to look down and judge our fellow humans as surplus population. So this Christmas, let's try to fight that urge. Reach out. Remember your local food banks, whether you need to go there or you have a little extra you can take there. And tell me in the comments below, do you think I missed any great Christmas classics that deal with these themes? Hit that like and subscribe button, and peace out, my wonderful viewers. Step into a world of science and of story, of laughter and of tears. Betty Adams has crafted entire worlds of science fiction and science fantasy adventure in her Humans Are Weird series and in her Dying Embers series. Be prepared to laugh, cry, and become absorbed. Check out her books at the links below the video.